This episode of The Memory Palace is brought to you by Article. We are big fans of Article here at The Memory Palace. This room of the palace, the ballroom where I'm sitting right now, it's palatial, trust me, is lit beautifully by a legit beautiful lamp from Article. This stuff is of extraordinarily high quality. It is truly lovely furniture that's influenced by, mid-century modern and Scandinavian styles. I have a feeling you're really going to like it. If you've never checked it out before, summer and warmer weather is right around the corner here in the Northern Hemisphere. And they really have fantastic outdoor furniture. It's totally worth checking out. Go to article.com and take a look. The stuff looks great, and it is made with all these outdoor-friendly materials like teak and acacia wood and granite and galvanized steel and rattan. And it comes to you with a flat delivery fee of $49, regardless of what you're buying and how big the order is. So go to www.article.com/memorypalace and get $50 off your first purchase of $100 or more. That is www.article.com/memorypalace. Go check it out. I'm excited to tell you guys about a new sponsor that solves the underlying problem of furniture shopping, which is you look at the stuff online and you have no idea whether it's going to actually work in your room. Well, say hello to Modsy. With Modsy, you can see new furniture in a 3D model of your actual room and redecorate it until you get your room just right. You're going to send Modsy a few photos of the room, you're going to answer a short online style quiz, and that's it. Then you have this sort of 3D model of your room, and then you can take furniture that they have from all these great partners, like Crate and Barrel and West Elm, and spin them around, and you can see exactly how they're going to look in your space. And there's no more, crossing your fingers and just hoping it's going to fit, or crossing your fingers and just hoping that the colors aren't going to clash. You can swap stuff out until you find just the right thing you're looking for. So head over to modsy.com/memory and you can get yourself a 20% discount on your first room. That's modsy.com/memory. This is The Memory Palace. I'm Nate DiMeo. Louis Kesselberg wasn't a good man. He cursed and he stole. He would drink and get into moods, and then get into fights. He beat his wife. He was cruel. Louis Kesselberg wasn't a good man. But he didn't eat those people. In May of 1846, a wagon train carried 87 pioneers west from Independence, Missouri, bound for the Sierras and the Sacramento River Valley beyond. There were 9 families in the caravan, but I only need you to see 2. The Kesselbergs, the father, Louis, a German immigrant, 30 years old, 6 feet and strong, holding the reins at the front of a covered wagon. His wife, 10 years younger, huddled in the back with their infant son and 3-year-old daughter. And the Donners, 12 members in all, led by the father, George, his wife, Tamsin, his brother's wife, and 8 children. The oldest was 13. The youngest, Eliza, was 2. See her, wrapped in a blanket and in her mother's arms, as the woman tries to keep the little girl dry and warm as a sudden storm sweeps across the prairie. See little Eliza learning how to run and to jump and to speak in sentences, all while traveling night after day, month after month, across the North American continent. 1 out of 8 children, 8 mouths to feed, but 8 extra bodies, at least the older ones, to help push and to clear the rocks that blocked their wagons and slowed them all down. That is what did the Donner Party in. They were too slow. And that's why so many of them died in the winter of 1845, 1846. Though others died before they even got to the mountain pass that would someday bear the party's name. They lost 1 to tuberculosis, 3 to accidents. Louis Kesselberg kicked an old man who worked for him out of his wagon, forced him to walk, and the walking killed him. Louis Kesselberg wasn't a good man. Those deaths slowed them down. There were reasons they were too slow. Reasons they arrived at the mountain pass at the end of October, when the snow began to fall. Between the 1st of November 1846 and the 1st of May the following year, 36 members of the Donner Party died. Some from the cold, some from injuries or illnesses for which there was no care, others from starvation. One, a 12-year-old boy, died right after being rescued from overeating. Others died in ways that have since been lost in the snow. But 46 people came out of the woods. 46 people survived to go on and go off and mourn their dead, and build homes and find work, and live out the rest of their lives. But I only need you to see two. Eliza Donner was 3 years old when she was rescued from the mountain. She was taken from her parents, who let her go because they were told there was another rescue party arriving soon. She and her two half-sisters, both in their early teens, were brought to a fort run by the United States Army, and they waited there for their parents, who were expected any day. But days turned to weeks, and winter turned to spring. And then, one evening, just before bedtime, Eliza heard a knock, and she looked up from where she was playing on the dirt floor of their adobe hut. Two bearded men with sad eyes removed their hats and whispered to Eliza's big sister in the doorway, and then her big sister started to cry. The people at the fort, especially the women, were kind, or they tried to be anyway. They told her how sad they felt for her, how much better it would have been for her to have died up there with her parents, rather than live without them. They'd reprimand their children for wanting to play with her. She was 3. Later, as an adult, she remembered running off to be alone among the wildflowers, to get away, she wrote, from the torturing sympathy. But she would never be able to run far enough. She would never be able to step beyond the shadow cast by the events of that winter. Because although she must have remembered very little of what happened to her on the trail, flickering faces, a feeling of her mother's lips on her cheek, of her father's hand in her hair, she heard about it over and over as she grew up and as she grew old. You still hear it now. 100 His wife and their own 3-year-old girl were rescued in February. And when he was rescued, 12 weeks later, he learned 2 things. His daughter had not survived the trip to safety, and people now called him Keseberg the Cannibal. This story had preceded him. It went like this. When Eliza Donner's parents let her go off with the men, there was another set of men following right behind. The Donners would only need to hang on for a few days, 2 weeks at the most. But then more snow fell, and the rescuers had to turn back. When men finally came again, it was spring, and all that they found in their camp were the Donner's bones, and, sorry about this, their organs, cooking in a pot over a fire lit by Louis Keseberg, who had done something much worse than merely resorting to cannibalism. He had jump-started the process by killing Mrs. Donner, and he had also stolen all their money, about $6,000. That was the story that came down the mountain. There was no proof. It didn't matter. He sued for defamation and won. It didn't matter. Louis Keseberg was not a good man. He beat his wife. Everyone knew it. He drank, he got into fights. He made that old man walk in the desert, and the walking killed him. He was just the kind of man who would kill poor little Eliza Donner's mother. He was Keseberg the Cannibal, everywhere he went, for the rest of his life. When he would try to get a job, when he would try to sit quietly at the end of the bar and drink a beer, kids threw rocks at him as he walked down the street. Men would throw drinks at him. They'd throw punches. And it is hard to be a good man when you are Keseberg the Cannibal. He'd punch back. And he cheated in business. He took on aliases and tried to get loans, which is illegal, if understandable. He would try to disappear, to escape the shadow cast by the horrible things that he swore he never did, and cast by the real regrets, the real wrongs, that he had piled up over this life of his, when he hadn't been a good man. So he would move his family, and take on a new identity, and start a new business and find his feet, until someone would find out that he was the man who had killed and eaten Eliza Donner's mother. And then it would all fall apart again. In March of 1879, Eliza Donner heard a knock. She got up from her couch and crossed the parlor of her elegant home in San Jose. There was yet another writer at the door. They came by now and then. They were working on books. They were interviewing survivors. They needed to follow up on something she'd said to someone else some other time. She didn't mind. She was one of them. Eliza Donner spent her adult life researching the history of the Donner Party, and trying to understand what happened during that winter that she could barely remember. So when yet another man came to the door wanting to ask her about those days, and to tell her what he learned in his research, there wasn't anything he could tell her that would surprise her. She had read all the same books. She had talked to all the same people. And none of them could tell her what she wanted to know. None of them could tell her what really happened to her parents. There was only one man who could. And he never talked to anyone. And he hadn't been seen in years. And he was probably dead. And so when this man in her living room said he could finally prove once and for all that Keseberg had killed her mother, Eliza nodded politely. She sipped her tea. But when he said he'd found Keseberg, and he was going to confront the monster who had murdered her mother, who had eaten her parents, she looked up, and she said she wanted to go with him. 2 months later, Eliza Donner knocked on Keseberg the cannibal's door. He invited her in. She hadn't seen him in 32 years, and he hadn't seen her since she was a toddler. Louis Keseberg told Eliza Donner that he was not a good man, but he was not the bad man people said he was. He had admired her parents. He told her he tried to help her mother but could not. And when she knew she would die, she asked him to bury her money by a tree and then bring it to her children when the winter thawed. And he did. But there were many trees, and there was a lot of snow. And he couldn't find it again. And when the rescuers found him near death, they didn't ask if there was anyone else alive. They didn't ask how they could help. They just asked where the money was. And when he couldn't tell them, they got mad. And they made up the story that created the character of Keseberg the cannibal. The one he had been ever since. He fell to his knees and begged her to believe him. And she asked him to stand where God could better see him. And he rose. And she held his hands. And he asked her to believe him. And she did. 30 years later, in 1911, Eliza Donner wrote a book about all she had learned about what happened to her family in the woods those years ago. And she wrote about that moment, there in an old man's living room, when two people who spent their lives as the victim and the villain in a story they did not write, held each other's hand and wrote their own ending.